People following this case feel it in their chest, the sense that something deeper is happening beneath the surface, something tied to years of neglect, silence, and unresolved pain. As more details come forward, the story surrounding Tyler Robinson and his roommate Lance Twiggs is turning into one of the most complicated and emotionally charged cases this year. And every new revelation feels like another weight added to the tragedy of losing Charlie Kirk, a man whose absence is still painfully visible across the Utah Valley University campus. Friends say Charlie had a way of making people feel like they mattered, even in a crowd of hundreds. His voice carried purpose, his humor broke tension, his presence created a sense of direction for people who didn't know they needed one. When you stand at the memorial built on the campus lawn, the photos, notes, flowers, you hear people whisper things like, "He didn't deserve this," and "Why didn't anyone stop it?" These are the questions echoing across the country. Only now, with new information emerging about Robinson's living situation, the investigation is shifting in unsettling ways. And viewers watching this case unfold online are beginning to notice patterns that weren't obvious at the start, but when placed side by side, paint a disturbing picture of the pressure cooker environment surrounding Tyler Robinson in the months before the killing. A relative of Twiggs has now come forward again, this time expanding on what was happening in that St. George townhome. She described nights where Twiggs locked himself in his room for hours, gaming until sunrise, sometimes snapping at people, sometimes crying, sometimes disappearing for days without explanation. She says Robinson witnessed all of it close up, every outburst, every relapse, every argument Twiggs had with family over the phone. But here's where the story takes a turn investigators didn't expect. According to the same relative, Twiggs often spoke about feeling controlled or influenced by Robinson. Other times, he flipped the narrative completely, saying he was the one keeping Robinson grounded. The relationship seemed to switch roles constantly, caretaker one day, adversary the next. Friends of the pair say they never understood the dynamic, and some avoided visiting the house altogether. One friend described it this way: "You felt like you were walking into a storm cloud. Something was always wrong, but no one said it out loud." You're left wondering, did this unstable bond between Twiggs and Robinson escalate emotional tension behind closed doors? Did arguments, confusion, or dependence blur lines in ways outsiders couldn't see? And how much did Twiggs truly know about Robinson's mindset in the weeks leading up to the shooting? This isn't speculation. It's becoming a central focus of the investigation. Detectives have interviewed Twiggs multiple times, and while he's not charged, the pressure around him is growing. People online question his role. Was he a bystander, a witness, or did he unknowingly feed into Robinson's emotional state? Now add another twist. Multiple messages recovered from Robinson's devices, revealed by prosecutors, show he expressed anxiety about law enforcement, finances, and personal conflicts. But in a few exchanges now under review, he referenced someone close to him losing control again. And investigators are trying to determine whether that someone was Twiggs. If confirmed, it raises an uncomfortable question. Did Robinson feel trapped in a house that was breaking down emotionally? And did that environment contribute to the decisions he made? These aren't excuses. They're pieces of a timeline investigators are trying to understand. And meanwhile, as the evidence piles up, Robinson's surrender still stands out as one of the more puzzling moments in the case. The sheriff who met with him described him as fearful and quiet, almost resigned. He agreed to turn himself in only if officers approached without weapons drawn. He repeatedly said he did not want a scene, especially at his parents' home. Some experts believe this fear reflects guilt. Others think it reflects panic. And there's a smaller group, people who study criminal behavior, who argue that it could suggest a deeper psychological break that went unnoticed for years. And while investigators dig into the pasts of both young men, the grief surrounding Charlie Kirk's death continues to spread. Families in the community say they're holding their children closer. Students are requesting more counseling resources. Alumni are asking why larger security measures weren't taken at campus events. People remember Charlie for his ability to challenge ideas without creating hostility. They remember him as someone who listened, even when he disagreed. And many now fear that the world is losing too many voices like his, voices that pushed conversations forward instead of shutting them down. As you're watching this, take a moment to stay with this story. There are layers unfolding that the public hasn't heard yet, and new information coming from inside the investigation suggests that the months leading up to the shooting may be more interconnected than anyone thought. If you want to follow each update and hear the full truth as it develops, make sure you subscribe and stay tuned, because the next chapter digs even deeper into what really happened inside that St. George townhome, and whether emotional instability, substance abuse, and quiet resentment created a chain of events that ended in a killing no one can take back. The more investigators uncover, the more disturbing the timeline becomes, and every new detail pulls us further into a story that still has far more questions than answers. Stay here. The investigation is only getting harder to ignore.
There is an emerging pattern investigators can't ignore, a pattern suggesting that the days leading up to the shooting may have involved far more movement, conversation, and emotional volatility than anyone initially realized. New interviews are revealing that Robinson and Twiggs were seen together in several locations around St. George during late-night hours, often appearing distracted, withdrawn, or preoccupied. One neighbor, who only stepped forward this week, described hearing arguments through the shared wall on more than one occasion. She didn't know the context, and she didn't catch the exact words, but she remembers the tone. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was sharp, low, and tense, like two people speaking through gritted teeth. She admitted she brushed it off, telling herself people argue all the time. Now she wishes she paid closer attention. Another witness, a delivery driver who frequented the area, mentioned seeing Robinson standing outside the townhome several times, staring at his phone as though debating whether to send a message. According to the driver, these moments had a strange stillness. Robinson barely moved, barely blinked, almost as if he was waiting for something to shift before he went back inside. It's these small observations that add weight to the investigation, showing how much emotional pressure Robinson may have been facing in private. And you can't help but think about how many opportunities society misses to check on people who are clearly struggling but don't know how to ask for help. Detectives have also begun examining a new batch of communications that appear to show Robinson contacting people he hadn't spoken to in months. One former friend from high school says he received a message that felt out of place, a message that simply said, "Everything feels heavy lately." At the time, the friend didn't know what to say. They hadn't spoken in years, and he assumed it was just stress or loneliness. Now he looks back at that message every night, wondering if it was a quiet cry for help disguised as small talk. As these pieces come together, investigators have started reconstructing a timeline of emotional strain layered with interpersonal conflict. And what stands out most is how many people sensed shifts in Robinson's behavior, but weren't sure how to respond. It's a reminder of how fragile communication has become in a world where reaching out feels risky and speaking up feels intrusive. You watch these details unfold and can't help but questioning how many tragedies develop in silence simply because no one wants to overstep. At the same time, scrutiny is increasing around the interactions between Robinson and certain individuals at Utah Valley University in the weeks before the shooting. A few students recall short, uncomfortable encounters with him, moments where he seemed distracted, unfocused, or overly curious about events logistics. None of these interactions were threatening, none warranted a report, but viewed through today's lens, they reveal an individual who may have been wrestling with something bigger than what anyone could see on the surface. And in a surprising twist, a professor has now disclosed that Robinson emailed him shortly before the shooting, asking for an extension on a minor assignment. The professor described the message as oddly formal, almost robotic, lacking any personal tone. It read like someone trying to mimic normal behavior without fully understanding how to express emotion. The professor approved the extension, thinking it was a small gesture that might ease the stress of the student. Now he questions whether that moment carried more weight than he realized. Meanwhile, people close to Twiggs are pushing back against assumptions. Friends of his insist that while he carried personal struggles, he wasn't someone who encouraged violence. They describe him as conflicted, overwhelmed, and often confused about his own direction. But none of them recall hearing him speak about harming others or supporting harmful actions. Even so, investigators continue to probe his influence, direct or indirect,
because relationships under strain can create emotional shadows that alter choices in unpredictable ways. One of the more compelling developments comes from a co-worker of Twiggs who claims he once mentioned feeling unsafe at home, though he provided no details and quickly changed the subject. Detectives are now revisiting this conversation as they try to determine whether tensions in the townhome may have escalated in ways neither roommate understood how to navigate. And it makes you think about how isolation and emotional pressure can create situations where people live side by side without truly seeing one another's internal storms. As the investigation expands, a digital forensics team is examining several devices connected to the case. Early findings suggest that Robinson searched for information related to stress, anxiety, and emotional breakdowns in the months leading up to the shooting. These were not searches for violence, they were searches for relief. This discovery adds another layer of complexity to the case, a reminder that people often cry out quietly through their online behavior while appearing composed in public. If you're watching this unfold, take a moment to stay connected to this story. There are updates coming that may shift the public's understanding of the emotional landscape behind this crime. You might want to subscribe if you're following each new development as it surfaces. Behind every interview, every recovered message, and every unexplained moment, investigators continue to see a pattern of quiet distress woven through the lives of those involved. It's a story of overlooked signals, unspoken fears, and unaddressed conflicts. And as the truth continues to unfold, the weight of responsibility grows heavier on the people who witnessed pieces of this long before the public did. Yet, even with everything revealed so far, key questions remain unanswered. What exactly happened inside that townhome in the final days? What conversations took place behind closed doors? Who noticed changes? And who ignored them? And how many people now wish they had stepped forward sooner, asked one more question, or paid closer attention? The investigation is widening, and every step forward feels more unsettling than the last. Stay tuned. The next developments may finally expose the emotional fault lines that shaped everything that followed.
And now investigators are starting to uncover a new thread, one tied to a set of overlooked exchanges between Robinson and an acquaintance he interacted with only occasionally. This acquaintance, a former classmate from a community course, came forward after recognizing Robinson's name in the news. She told detectives that weeks before the shooting, he reached out unexpectedly, asking vague questions about how people deal with guilt, regret, and emotional pressure. She assumed he was struggling with academics or family issues. She had no idea what those messages might reflect when viewed through the context of everything that followed. Her voice cracked during the interview as she admitted she brushed off the conversation, telling herself he was just venting. You can almost feel the weight of that regret pressing on her now. Another lead emerged when investigators obtained access to surveillance footage from a gas station near the townhome. The footage shows Robinson inside late one night, pacing between aisles and picking up items only to put them back down again. Nothing he did was illegal, nothing hinted at violence, but the behavior looked uncertain, like someone carrying thoughts he couldn't put into words. The cashier on duty at the time recalled him asking a question so out of place, she remembered it clearly. He wanted to know if the store had a hotline number for people feeling overwhelmed. She directed him to a small pamphlet near the counter. According to her, he stared at it for several seconds before leaving without taking it. That moment has now become part of the official timeline. At the same time, detectives are looking into an encounter involving Twiggs at a campus coffee shop. A student barista who served him regularly says he appeared distracted, anxious, and unusually quiet during their last interaction. He stood at the counter long after paying, almost as though he didn't want to return to wherever he came from. The barista asked if he was okay. He nodded, but his hands were shaking. These quiet details matter because they show how many chances there were to see trouble forming, yet no one knew how to interpret the signs. And it forces you, the viewer, to sit with the uncomfortable truth that tragedy rarely appears in dramatic flashes. It often shows up in whispers that people brush aside because they feel unsure or unequipped. Investigators are also reviewing posts across several online communities where Robinson and Twiggs were active.
Some discussions hint at emotional exhaustion, late-night arguments, and a sense of feeling overlooked. In one thread, a user believed to be Robinson mentioned feeling buried under expectations. Another, believed to be Twiggs, commented about losing control of who I'm supposed to be. While none of these posts contain threats or harmful intent, the emotional undertones are unmistakable. And looking at them now, you can't avoid asking yourself whether online spaces have become places where people pour out distress to strangers because they no longer feel supported by the people closest to them. Meanwhile, a new witness, a maintenance worker who serviced several units in the area, told detectives he entered the townhome weeks earlier to repair a faulty outlet. He remembers the living room in a state that didn't match two young adults renting a clean townhome. There were stacks of unopened mail, discarded notes, and a whiteboard containing lists that didn't make sense to him. He said one side had chores and schedules, while the other side contained vague phrases like "stay focused," "don't lose control," and "fix things before it gets worse." Though none of these phrases are criminal, they are now clues, guiding investigators deeper into the emotional landscape of the people involved. Even more unsettling is the testimony from a mutual friend who interacted with both roommates a few months prior. She describes a tension between them that she couldn't identify. She recalls moments where Robinson seemed protective one minute and distant the next, while Twiggs appeared both dependent and resentful. Their dynamic, she explained, didn't fit into a simple category. It felt like two people trying to navigate personal struggles while leaning on each other in ways that weren't always healthy. And when you hear that, it forces you to think about how many relationships quietly fall apart under emotional pressure long before anything tragic happens. As the case widens, pressure continues to build on law enforcement to reveal more, especially as the public remains shaken by the loss of Charlie. Students still leave handwritten notes at the spot where he last stood, and his absence is felt in the most ordinary places. Classrooms he used to visit, hallways where he used to speak with students, and campus areas where his presence once brought energy. People walk past those memories now with a sense of disbelief. Many say they still expect to see him there, smiling or greeting them by name. The emotional gap left behind is unmistakable, and it fuels a longing for answers that still haven't been provided. If you want to stay informed as new developments surface, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next update. Investigators say they're expecting major shifts in the coming days as they analyze more digital records and interview individuals who only recently stepped forward. And even with all these emerging pieces, the heart of this case remains shrouded in unanswered questions. Why did certain conversations stop suddenly? What changed in the final days before the shooting? Who knew more than they admitted? And what critical moment in the weeks before everything unfolded carried more meaning than anyone recognized at the time? The investigation continues, the tension deepens, and the truth, piece by piece, is moving closer to the surface. Stay with us.